thank you for mentioning Jeff as well. You know, that was kind of a spooky deal. And we're sure thankful that it went so well, and he was in the right place, in the right hands, at the right time, and they were able to take care of him. So let's remember them and that good family in our prayers. All right, John 18. This is where we are tonight. Let's notice this is perhaps one of the most challenging chapters in the entire Bible. Nathan, would you mind turning me down just a little bit? This is one of the most challenging chapters in the entire Bible, not because there are great big textual difficulties here, not because there are some really rich theological concepts that are just really beyond what we can think. It is because the content of this chapter, and the content particularly of the next chapter, is really the foundation of who we are and who we are as we follow Jesus Christ. Larry mentioned the cross. Well, guys, we're getting right down to it now. Cross doesn't show up till the next chapter, but I'm going to tell you, you read chapter 18 without really thinking what he's saying, you're missing some stuff. And I would maybe push you a little bit further and say that John 18 is perhaps one of the saddest chapters in the entire Bible. And that is taking into consideration the cross in the next chapter. But I'm going to tell you, this is where it's at, folks. John 18, verse 1, please. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples over the brook Kidron, where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a band of soldiers and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came together with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Then as soon as he had said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, "Whom are you seeking?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, 'Of those whom you gave me, I have lost none.' Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Then Jesus said to Peter, 'Put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me?'" All right, so when he had spoken these words, could be a reference to the prayer in chapter 17, but probably is more of a reference to all of these words. These words being the private discourse, 14, 15, 16, and the prayer in 17. So after he said these things, he goes out across the brook Kidron. Now, the brook Kidron is a major part of the geography of the Bible. Let me give you a couple of ideas here. I want to kind of reiterate some of this. We're looking right now late Thursday night. So we're dealing with Gethsemane late night. Gethsemane is not mentioned here, but we recognize from the Synoptic Gospels that's where he is, in the Garden of Gethsemane, across the Kidron Valley, opposite the Temple Mount, and overlooking the Temple Mount. This may be helpful, and we might refer to this a couple of times. This is kind of the hour by hour, for the most part, through Thursday night, through Friday morning. And I'll come back to this in just a second. I want to show you this, though. So the brook Kidron is this Kidron Valley right here. Dry most of the year during the wet, rainy winter months. It would be wet. It would be still crossable for the most part, except for maybe in a downpour, a flood of some sort. But the reality is, lots of places in this part of the world, water's channeled to the lower parts, but other than that, it's pretty much crossable year-round. So the Kidron Valley is to the east side of the temple complex. You can see this here, the Garden of Gethsemane. And the Kidron Valley plays a significant role because when David flees from Absalom, this is the valley he crosses barefoot and mourning. So there's some symbolism here. Okay? The king of Israel fleeing from his oppressor. And now Jesus not fleeing, but Jesus crossing the brook Kidron to the Garden of Gethsemane. We might zoom in and look at some of these pictures a little bit closer. Honestly, probably not as much. But here's kind of a model recreation on the left side of your screen, and then the modern picture today. And of course, there's the big Muslim mosque there in the center, the Temple of the Rock. But here's the Kidron Valley, and here's the traditional site of Gethsemane. In fact, you can still see, boom, some of the shrubbery there. And for the most part, this was probably a walled garden. You go and read not just John's account here, but the synoptics, and there's a whole lot of emphasis of Jesus going into the garden. Well, into would suggest walls, okay? And coming out of would suggest walls. And so this is probably a walled garden of some sort. And then, of course, here again, here's the valley. Here's the valley. That's the same picture. All right. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, here in a minute, he's going to end up at the high priest's palace, but there are some questions here as to whether or not it's here or over here, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. So the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is in this garden. John does not record some of the more intimate, let this cup pass from me statements, but he does reveal some knowledge of them. We read it at the end of our reading in verse 11. So he goes to this garden, which he and his disciples entered. Verse 2, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place. Read the synoptics. They knew the place because Jesus frequented this place. And so even Judas knew where he was. And so Judas, verse 3, having received a band of soldiers, is that rendered another way in one of your translations? Maybe not band of soldiers. What is it, Karen? Roman cohort. Now, a full Roman cohort, a full battalion, was around 1,000 soldiers. In fact, the commander here, my text doesn't say this here, but the officers, your translations say commanders and chief priests. So you have, commanders were over 1,000. In fact, that's what that word meant, was leader of 1,000. And so you had individuals, I mean, this big full Roman cohort, 1,000 soldiers. Now, a normal cohort was about 600, and then they had what was called a maniple, which was a third of a cohort, around 200. Now, it's quite possible that there were 200 soldiers that went out to him. Probably not the case, but here's what I want you to see. We're not looking at like 6 buddies with a torch, okay? We're not looking at just 6 dudes that go out to Jesus. We're looking at a large number, okay? And I'm not going to say it's you know, even a maniple, 200 people, 200 soldiers, but it's sure not nothing to slouch at. Okay? Now, there are some things in the text that hint at why this would be the case. Notice the last part of verse 3. So they come out. Judas is with this band of soldiers, and notice this, having received a band of soldiers. The officers from the chief priests, the Pharisees, they all come out. Now, all of this, we have Roman officials represented, we have Jewish officials represented, and we have temple authorities. Okay? This is like the Jewish police squad. These were the individuals that were really in charge of protecting the holiness of the temple itself. But they operated under the Sanhedrin Council and particularly under the high priest himself, kind of almost like the National Guard. National Guard works for the government. At the same time, they respond directly to the president. So, I think that's right. Some of you military people can correct me later if I'm wrong. But right now, what we have is lots of different people coming out. Now, here's what we're seeing in verse 3. They mean business. Why would I say they mean business? In fact, I would maybe say there are 2 reasons I say in verse 3 they mean business. What is it, Larry? They have weapons and the number. There are so many of them. Okay, they're not going out there to slap somebody on the wrist. They're going out there expecting opposition and ready to deal with it. Okay, they're not going out just a handful. They're going out with a good number of soldiers, temple authorities, chief priests. They're loaded for bear. Now, what in the text tells us it's deep into the night? They need lanterns and torches. You seeing this? Now, here's what I want you to notice. Because of the brook Kidron, you know, anybody that takes the view, well, Jesus was caught by surprise. No, that's dumb. Now, here's why I say that's dumb. It's late at night. A mob of soldiers carrying weapons. Is that quiet as a church mouse? No. That's pretty noisy. They're crossing the brook Kidron, coming from the temple complex, down the brook Kidron, up the other side of the mount to Garden of Gethsemane. All of this is in view of Jesus. Even without Him being omniscient, He can see them coming. Everybody following that idea? He can see them coming. Okay, so we have Roman officials, Jewish officials, weapons, lanterns, torches, loaded for bear, and ready to whip some Jewish people in a garden. Now, verse 4, Jesus, therefore knowing all things would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? Now, you got to ask, the text just said Jesus knew all this, and then the text in the same verse says he asks a question. Why ask the question? It's rhetorical, okay? Maybe. He's going to ask another question, same thing, basically, in verse 7. Wonder if that has anything to do with Judas. I want you to see this. We're going to work on this for just a second here. Look at verse 5. They answered, oh, we're here. We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He said to them, I am he. Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. As soon as he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Anybody else going, what? They drew back and fell to the ground. Now, I want you to picture this. We're reading this, and honestly, it may happen all more simultaneously. You know, we read in linear fashion. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, when in the reality, this may be happening. Now, why I stress some of this is Jesus is absolutely confident in who He is and what He's doing. There is no timidity in the person of Jesus in verse 3 and 4. Oh, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? No. He goes out to meet them. Now, if you're in this mob, and I'm going to tell you, a lot of pens have been used up trying to figure out why these men fell back. I'm not sure why either. But I will say this, it could have something to do with his statement in verse 5, I am he. Now remember, we've already made a big deal of that in John's Gospel. When Jesus says, I am, what is He referring to? I'm God. I am, yeah, like Moses and God in the burning bush. When Moses said, who do I tell them is sending me back? He says, you tell them, I am sent you. When Jesus says, I am, in the Gospel of John, whatever pronoun follows that is irrelevant. When He says, that's not totally irrelevant. Follow me for a second. When He says, I am, He's making a big theological claim. I'm God. I am God. I am the one in the burning bush. Okay, that's why before Abraham was, I am, John 8. Okay, so now all of these ideas come together, so it could be they fall back almost in shock. Ha ha ha, blasphemy. But I will tell you, it almost makes a lot of sense. I mean, you know, you got this mob going out, rah, 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 we're going to get him. And then a man would expect him to be timid and, what's going on? And what does Jesus do? Who are you seeking? You know, if it is night, it is night. If it is what is expected, you wouldn't expect him to do that. So it's, you know, it's almost like the domino effect. Wait, the guy's approaching us. Nobody approaches us. Okay, so maybe that's why they fall back. I'm not going to arm wrestle you either way. But it is interesting. He reiterates, I am he. Or at least John reiterates for us, they fall back to the ground. It blows my mind, and you'll hear me preach this sermon at some point. This is not the only point I make in that sermon, but it blows my mind that He lets them get back up. He's God in the flesh, knowing what's coming, and He lets them they all fall down, and He lets them get back up. And in a few verses, they're going to handcuff Him. So verse 7, then He asked them again, whom are you seeking? They said, Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I said, why is He asking the question? Well, maybe it is rhetorical. Several writers made the observation that perhaps this is His final effort to prick the heart of Judas Iscariot. You see, Jesus doesn't ask a question because He doesn't know the answer. Jesus never asks a single question in the gospel accounts that He does not already know the answer. You got to ask then, why does He ask the question? It's for another reason, isn't it? He asked the question for a different reason totally. And generally speaking, if we want to try to generalize it for a second, Jesus asks the question to try to make the person think. And I think we're going to get a little of that in John 18. Jesus does things here with the audience in mind. And I don't mean us, I mean the audience in the passage. And so He says, verse 8, I've told you that I am He. Therefore, if you seek Me, let these go their way. So He says, I am. Now, let these men go. Why would He say, well, let these men go? What's one of the big promises he kept making to the apostles in chapter 14, 15, and 16, guys? What's one of the big promises he kept making? And don't overthink this. Okay, that he would send the Comforter, you bet. Even in this immediate context, here we have a mob out to arrest Jesus, and he says, hey, you found me, let them go. Now, it's kind of hard to summarize what I'm thinking here. I can see it on your faces, but here's what he promised them. John 14, 15, and 16, he promised them that he would keep them safe. I'll protect you. I'll protect you. I'll protect you. And I'm going to send the Holy Spirit. And He's going to comfort you. He's going to bring you to all truth. He's going to guide you. He's going to make sure you're comforted, right? You're going to have peace in the world and tribulation, but me, you're going to have peace. And here Jesus is protecting His apostles. Hey, you got me. Let them go. And then verse 9, that the saying might be fulfilled which He spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have lost none. Kind of interesting to tie that in here. Certainly, Judas was lost in a very physical sense, too. I mean, Judas, when you kill yourself, that's kind of, you're lost altogether, okay? So, maybe there's a little twofold usage of that idea being played out here, but Jesus, He's not losing anybody. My people are mine. I'm going to keep them safe. Peter says, hold on, Lord, I got this. Verse 10. So Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. I love the way the internet has done this. You read the synoptics and it says, well, one of the disciples struck this servant. One of the disciples struck the servant. And then the video on YouTube or whatever will say, John comes along and says, oh yeah, that was Peter. Totally ratted on the other apostle. So yeah, Peter's the one who draws out the sword. Now it is actually interesting though, the historical nature of this. If John's writing at a later date, which I believe he is, Peter's already been dead for a few years. So if there are any repercussions to him from the Jewish authorities, he's already dead at this point. They can't do anything to him. So maybe there's some of that playing out. I wouldn't push that very far, but that is interesting. He draws the sword and he lops off the high priest's servant's right ear. Now, a couple of ideas. When he does this, somebody said, oh, see, he's trying to disqualify the man from serving as a priest because any blemish on the priest, can't serve anymore. Particularly, do you remember the practice? The big right toe, the right ear, oh, see, we lop his right. Come on, this is a fisherman. You read through the text, what it looks like is not that Peter is this skilled swordsman. Just going to take a little off the edge. No, it looks like Peter draws the sword, attempts to lop the dude's head off to fight, and misses. Now, a few weeks ago I preached on this idea. This is really fascinating. You read through this and you go, oh, what in the world happened? Yeah, John doesn't tell us. But the synoptics already have. What happens? What happens to Malchus's ear? He put it back on. I was scared one of you were going to be like, Evander Holyfield. No. Yeah, he put it back on. He put it back on. So protecting Peter again. Peter, put your sword away. That's not what we're going to do. What's significant about verse 10? The fact that I'll give two of them. Well, no, I'm going to give one of them away. The fact that Simon Peter is identified. There are two other things in verse 10 that are incredibly significant from a historical perspective. Anybody know what they are? Think. What's cut off? No, not just the ear. The right ear. That's pretty specific, isn't it? What else is specified in verse 10? The name. You guys see this? There are three little points in verse 10 that remind us we're dealing with the real historical eyewitness account. Now, here's why this is so fascinating. Individuals that try to challenge the veracity of the New Testament, oh, you people believe a bunch of nonsense. Let me tell you something, guys. You name the people involved, that's pretty powerful. Because what's going to happen? One of the charges that Luke makes in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 is, I tracked this stuff down. I verified this information. What's the point? 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 10, when Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that He appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time who are still with us to this day. In a chapter where individuals are denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, Paul says, yeah, more than 500 brethren saw Him at one time. What's his point? You go interview those people. Ooh. You see, when you start naming people, all of a sudden, people reading this in the actual first century can go, wait a minute, Malchus? Malchus? I know him. Or I know somebody that knows him. Or I know somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody that knows him. Yeah. You can go verify it. In fact, actually, a couple of ancient writers theorized that Malchus is maybe a disciple of John. And that's why he's named. Not just because John knows him, verse 15, we're going to get to that in a second, but because he was a convert. And so maybe that's why he's named as a person to verify the truth. So verse 15 is going to clear that up a little bit more for us. Verse 11, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? And there I say, when Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane says, let this cup pass from me, John reveals some knowledge of it in verse 11. Here's the cup, and Jesus says, I need to drink it. Questions on those first 11 verses? This is tough. It wasn't uncommon, and we do know from the synoptics that the disciples had at least one sword with them. Now there is some challenges to this because of the Passover restrictions, and Jews were generally not. It was frowned upon to carry swords during Passover and so forth. Boy, that gets way beyond my pay grade. Larry? Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and here's what's fascinating about that, Larry. That idea is going to come up again in just a minute. Okay, now here's what I want you to hold on to Larry's point, because I'm going to tell you that's going to pop up again in a place, and you're going to go, I never thought about that before. Okay, it's going to tie right in with it. So let's handle verse 12. The band of soldiers, their captain, the officers of the Jews, arrested Jesus and bound him. They led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was he who gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, verse 12 is one of the most ironic passages in the entire Bible. Why would I say that? Why would I say that is one of the most, if not the most, ironic passage in the entire Bible? Let's tie a couple of ideas together. Who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? God. God in the flesh. They bound him. Now, folks, if that's not irony, I don't know what is. Can you bind God? No. I mean, you know, God who made everything, oh, there is a substance He made that's particularly strong. Just wrap it just the right way, tie it with just the right knot, and even God can't slip out of it. Come on. Folks, this is intended to get our attention. You can't bind God, but they did. Boy, now we got to ask, how? How did they bind God in the flesh? And don't overthink this, by the way. Oh, there we go. Now that right there is worth cooking all over again. He let them. What's about to happen to Jesus? He let them. Okay, verse 13. A couple of problems in verse 13 and 14, especially historically. He says he led him to Annas and then Caiaphas. Well, how many high priests do we have? Now, high priests were supposed to serve essentially for life. That was the Old Testament law. But by the New Testament, what happens? Rome comes in and says, we put the high priest in place. And so, if they don't like the high priest, they replace him. Generally speaking, when a Roman governor took over his procuratorship, he would generally just take and replace the high priest and put in a new one that he liked, or that would work well with him. Now, Annas was the high priest. He served from 6 to 15. And then after him, Annas, that household was one of the most powerful families in the Jewish world in the first century. Because if memory serves me, 5 of his descendants served as high priest. 5 of his descendants. I think, if memory serves, 3 sons, 1 grandson, and 1 son-in-law. So Annas is a mover and shaker. In Jewish minds, hey, Jesus is a popular figure. We've got to get him taken care of. So we're going to need everybody's support on this. They go to Annas first. They want his approval. Then they'll go to Caiaphas, who in the Roman eyes was the official high priest. Now they're going to have to get both men to sign off if they want Jesus killed. Now, a couple of other historical points here that are really important. This is during the feast. Okay, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, right after the Passover. That means Jewish people were particularly fervent and ready to throw arms any chance they got. Which is why all the Roman legion that was stationed at Caesarea Philippi were generally shipped to Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's population swelled massive numbers. Rome sent in a bunch of soldiers so they could handle it. All that's playing into what's happening here, guys. That's why, say, how many people actually went out to arrest Jesus? A bunch. Don't know how many, but a bunch. And the reason is, Rome wanted to keep their thumb right on top of Jerusalem during the feast days. Jerusalem was ready to throw arms any chance they got. Rome said, that's not happening. So that's what's going on here in some of this. They want, the Jews particularly, they've got to get both guys on the bandwagon here to get all of this done. Now, Caiaphas has already been mentioned to us once. That's what's referenced in verse 14. Now, generally speaking, the high priest's household, there would have been perhaps one house and then maybe another house, and they shared a common courtyard. And that's why we're going to read some of this in a second. You're going to go, wait a minute, he's with Annas, but now he's going to Caiaphas, but how can he go? What's going on here? Well, that's probably why it's so confusing to read in a orderly fashion, okay? So he's arrested in the garden. Let me put some of this in time frame for you. He's arrested in the garden. Now we're going before Annas, the first Jewish trial. So Peter, verse 15, followed at a distance. So did another disciple. We're not told which disciple that is, but it is presumably John. That disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. Then the servant girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." And the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold. They warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. All right. So Peter and John follow along, and it says twice, the disciple was known to the high priest. Some of that you read and you think, why is that? Why is the high priest, why does he know John? Well, pretty good indicator in the New Testament. John's family was fairly wealthy. Him and his brother James, the sons of Zebedee, owned a fishing business in Galilee, probably fairly wealthy, and that might indicate they would have known the movers and shakers in Jerusalem. Okay, so we don't really know, but that would be presumable as any other option would be. So they go there. Peter stands outside the door. The other disciple, John, goes and speaks to the servant girl so that she will let him in. She apparently knows that John is one of his disciples because she says, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he said, "Aha, I'm not." Verse 18, what are we getting? Historical relevant details. What are we getting in verse 18 that helps us here? The weather. What about the weather? Somebody explain a little bit. What about the weather? It's cold. You notice little details. Little details. Eyewitness account, huh? It's cold. They're warming themselves by the fire. Boy, that also coincides with the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Being a little cooler at night. See, little details helping us here all along the way. So Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. You notice the two big key points here, disciples and doctrine. Let me tell you why very quickly. He wants to know what he's been teaching and how far the error has spread. That's what he wants to know about. How much damage have you done, sir? And how much fixing are we going to have to do? So he said, verse 20, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet. And in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard me what I have said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. When he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. Now verse 20, kind of puzzling. He says, I've always spoke openly. Well, guys, what was John 14 through 16? That was a private discussion. So is he contradicting what he just did in John's Gospel? No, not at all. What Jesus does publicly is the same thing he was doing privately. All he did privately was explain what he had done publicly. So, he gives a parable publicly. And then privately, when the disciples ask, he explains the parable. But everything he's been saying has been consistent. He has said one resounding thing the whole time. I am the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, they don't want what he says. Verse 21, why are you asking me? Ask those who heard me. Ask those who heard me. What would we call that in our modern world? Ask those who heard me. Witness. Witness. He says, check the witnesses. Now, I will say, first century Jewish trial, this is not an official trial yet, but follows a similar template that the American judicial system follows. There must be witnesses. And the witnesses are called to testify, in a lot of cases, before the person who's being charged. And so, he says, they indeed know what I said. And then one of the officers struck him with the palm of his hand. Sound familiar to anybody? This happens another time in Scripture. Anybody know where it is, or at least who it happened to? Pretty good guess when I set up a question like that is, if it's not Jesus, it's going to be who? The Apostle Paul. Apostle Paul has this exact same thing happen all over to him. He gets up, he's challenged, Paul, you tell us X, Y, and Z. And Paul says, I'm not doing all this nonsense. And an officer strikes him and says, you're going to speak to the high priest that way? Same thing all over again. Now, Jesus struck across the face, says in verse 23, if I've spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why do you strike me? I got to tell you, folks, that is a heartbreaking statement. Can somebody summarize that verse? What's he saying in verse 23? Maybe put it in our modern terminology. What's he saying in verse 23? I'm not lying. Yeah. Okay, I'm not lying. Yeah. Yeah. So let's think about this in a judicial sense. Because even though I'm not convinced this is a formal trial yet, John does not record that for us. The synoptics do, but John doesn't. John really summarizes, streamlines some things here. So, in a judicial setting, we would say, if I'm guilty, charge me. If I'm not guilty, then what are you doing? You see him doing that in verse 23? I'm not guilty. What have I done wrong here? If I'm wrong, then charge me. If I'm guilty, then do it. Let's get it done. Why do you strike me? Now, let's think for a second here. That's the same thing he did a second ago, isn't it, with Judas? Asking those questions. Right here, folks, right here in verse 23, it's still Jesus, true to his character, begging those who are accusing him to do simply what is right. And then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. And that's why I say probably just across the courtyard to Caiaphas' house. And we still have not gotten to the formal trial. So, verse 25. Verse 25, Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, you are not also one of his disciples, are you? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off. Did I not see you in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately a rooster crowed. Peter denied, Peter denied, Peter denied. Let me ask you this. Verse 26, if this fellow's in the garden, and this is his kinfolk who had his ears lopped off, how could he not identify Peter? It was dark. Thank you. You see? Little statements that reinforce historical veracity. You know, if you're making all this up, what would you have done? You wouldn't have put it in there that, well, you know, he wasn't really sure. Did I see you? No, you'd have just said it. Hey, you're one of those folks. No, none of that happened. Rooster crowed. Peter denied, rooster crowed. Now, let me kind of put some of this into perspective here. So we've got the arrest in the garden. We've got the first Jewish trial before Annas, the second Jewish trial before Caiaphas, Peter's denial in the courtyard of the high priest's home. That's where we've been working right here. Now we're going to the third Jewish council, the third Jewish trial. This would be the official trial in the Sanhedrin, in the temple complex. John does not record this. John does not record this. He's sent bound to high priest Caiaphas, verse 24. Verse 28, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. You got to read this and go, wait a minute, John. We're missing something, John. You just sent him to Caiaphas, and now Caiaphas is sending him to the praetorium. Why? Well, here's the reason, folks. John is summarizing some of these details, driving us with theological points. Okay? And the verdict's already been determined. Jesus is going to die. We just got to get the Romans convinced of it now. So he sends to Pilate's court, and now we're done here. Now this is around 6 a.m., and the reason I say 6 a.m. is because of the rooster crowing. That was a general practice in Judea. That's why the rooster crowed 3 times. All those ideas come out right here. And the final time the rooster crowed would have been around 6 a.m. By the way, historically, that's also about the time the Roman governor would start his daily projects. So all that's right there, verse 28. Let's work on this a little bit down through verse 38. They led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. It was early morning. They themselves did not go into the praetorium lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusations do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Then Pilate said to them, you take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered him, are you speaking for yourself, or did others tell you this about me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews, but now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, are you a king then? Jesus answered, you say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, what is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. All right, let's work on this pretty quickly. So he says the Jews didn't want to be defiled because if they enter a Gentile household, they're defiled. They can't observe the Passover. And here's the kicker. They've already observed the Passover, but generally speaking, the Jews determined the 7-day Feast of Unleavened Bread that followed the Passover as also part of the Passover. And so they said, we can't do that. We'll be defiled. Now, Pilate said, what accusations you bring against this man? And you'll notice verse 30, there's a little bit of vitriol in their response. Hey, this fellow's a bad dude, or we wouldn't have brought him here. Now, there's probably some backhands here, both directions. Pilate doesn't like the Jews. In fact, he hated them historically. The Jews hate Pilate. But we already know Pilate probably had some indication of what's going on because he gave them a Roman cohort to go arrest Jesus. That wouldn't have happened if Pilate didn't know about it. He would have had to sign that stamp. So there's already been some back and forth. Historically speaking, Caiaphas has probably already approached Pilate and said, hey, we got a dude we're going to kill. We got a dude we want you to do something with. And so his taunt to them in verse 29 is probably an insult, a little knife in the back here. Oh, what's wrong with this Jesus fella? Hey, he's a bad dude, or we wouldn't have brought him. Then Pilate says, verse 31, well, then you deal with him. You see? Oh, you can't deal with him. Jews could not execute somebody without the Roman permission slip. Well, that's not going to happen until we get Pilate on board. So Pilate entered then, verse 33, and he asked Jesus, "Are you king of the Jews?" You notice theological questions from the Jewish trials, but when they're in front of Roman officials, it's not theological questions, is it? It's political questions. This king business is scary stuff to Pilate. Are you a king? Jesus said, "Are you asking me this, or did you get this from somebody else?" So he says, "Am I a Jew?" Verse 35. "Your own nation, chief priests delivered to you. What have you done?" Jesus says, "My kingdom's not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my soldiers would fight." You see that? Remember Larry's point earlier? This has already been demonstrated in our chapter. If Jesus' kingdom was earthly, if he wanted to push back the forces of Rome, what would have happened? He'd have let Peter loose with that sword. But he already told Peter, "Put it away. That's not how we're going to do business." And so my servants will not fight. Pilate said, "Are you a king then?" And Jesus, notice this, he says, "I am. I am a king. Rightly do you say this? I was born for this cause." And he says, "This is the truth." Verse 38, what is truth? And Pilate says, I find nothing wrong with this man. Now, it just burns me up to fly through this so quickly. But verse 39, "But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Then they all cried again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. I want you to notice, this is a historical practice that we can find record of that Pilate did do during the Passover feast. This also kept them from getting too volatile. And you notice he knifes them a little bit in verse 39. "You want me to release the king of the Jews to you? You want me to do that?" They said, "No." Verse 40, Barabbas. Barabbas, ladies and gentlemen, is accused, not in John's Gospel, but is accused in the Synoptics, the same things they're trying to get Jesus killed for doing. Barabbas is guilty of these things, and Jesus is being charged with these things. A robber, an insurrectionist, a rebel. Yeah, a threat to the Roman Empire. That's what this is. All that's playing in right here. Oh, it burns me up. All right, questions? Really quickly. We only got about 2 minutes here. I really hate that we're having to break this up because Todd will be here Sunday and next Wednesday, so we'll pick this up the Sunday after Todd's meeting with us. But just kind of hang on to some of these ideas. You got to ask, why is there 3 crosses prepared that day? I would propose to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the middle cross was for Barabbas, and Jesus took his place. All right? Questions on the 75 verses we just covered in 3 minutes? Nothing? You're like, I'm going to have to go back and listen to that on halftime. Yeah, me too. Make sure I said the truth on the whole thing. All right, applications. I have scared you. I have scared you into not talking tonight. That happens sometimes. Number 1, Jesus was ever concerned for his disciples. You see that all through John's Gospel, but particularly in this chapter. Everything he does is with intention. Number 2, this is what sacrifice and humility look like. Literally letting himself be bound for the service of others. That is sacrifice and humility. Number 3, we have the credible eyewitness accounts. I put verses 10 through 18 on that, but you could put the whole chapter on that. Number 4, do we have the courage of Christ or the cowardice of Peter? And you notice that's big time contrasted in this chapter. Peter saying, "Well, I don't know." And Jesus saying, "I do know, and I'm going anyways." So which are we? And then number 5, Jesus' kingship is unlike any other. All right, thank you for your quick listening tonight. And Todd will be here Sunday, and then next Wednesday, Todd, and then the Sunday after we'll finish up chapter 19. Thank you for your attention tonight.